Well, this is lecture 124B in the ABCs of Communism series, and this set of lectures accompanies volume 7 that's forthcoming on communism in Europe. And our subject is the first part of a discussion about the proxy war that was going on in Europe between the fascist countries and England and France on the one side and the Soviet Union on the other. We're going to start with the discussion of the Spanish Civil War that went from July 17, 1936 through April 1st, 1939. Now, the Spanish kingdoms of Isabel and Fernando of Castile and Aragon emerged from the 1492 discovery of the New World incredibly rich. Then the nearly simultaneous discovery by Portuguese explorers of the Muslim circumventing Cape of Good Hope, tip of South Africa, enlarged on that wealth. Now, the route to the South Asian and the Far Eastern parts of the Old World put a permanent mark on Spain's subsequent socio-cultural evolution and that of Portugal too, namely by creating national enterprises bent on looting as opposed to producing commodities to acquiring wealth. Now, by stealing the gold, silver, and slave labor of the Americas, tremendous quantities of capital were accumulated in the hands of the feudal ruling classes of Spain and Portugal. Now, Isabel, the queen, wore the pants, literally, of her relationship with Fernando. She was not some kind of sheltered fairy tale princess. She put together the army that conquered Muslim Spain and the secret police force that kept her and Fernando in power as queen and king of Castile and Aragon and their newly emerging Spanish kingdom. And in the process, she expelled the Islamists and the Jews. She appeared frequently at the head of her army, mounted in leather from head to toe, booted in tailored Spanish chain steel armor. And what Isabel wanted, Isabel got. And just to be sure, she had her always present guardian force, their Hermandad, and they were the privileged thugs who later became the Praetorian Guard and secret police to see her will was made so. The global ideological agent of Isabel was the Pope of Rome, Alexander VI, the former Archbishop Borgia, Isabel's lover and sycophant. Now, Borgia declared the world divisible between two papist powers, Spain and Portugal. The Pope drew a line for Isabel dividing the entire world. He was giving virtually the entire Western Hemisphere to Spain, and everything east of the line to Portugal. East of that line, he included the eastern promontory of South America. Thus, Portugal got what is now Brazil. And so the world was divided effectively for 2 centuries, as far as the bosses of Europe were concerned. However, the point is that the two superpowers of Europe, Spain and Portugal, were bent on looting hard gold and silver, not on manufacturing commodities. Now, Isabel's suborning of the papist authority to the monopoly on enslavement and exploitation of the New World left Britain and Northern Europe out of the picture altogether. Therefore, this was a de facto declaration of war. That is, a war against emerging Protestant Europe, a war of the papal superpowers against England and Northern Europe. Now, Spain was against the rest of Europe, especially the Netherlands and England countries that wanted anyway, now, for their capitalist component. Thus, in the 1500s, Anglo-Protestant Europe was continuously in a sub-rosa Cold War of sorts, as in the historically and dramatically excellent Kate Blanchett movies, Elizabeth and Elizabeth the Golden Age. Nonetheless, the intercontinental conflict was deadly, as the Iberian New World colonies would testify, and as suffering raid after raid became their lot. In 1588, the Spanish royal family nobility oligarchy made a fateful final error. They suffered a massive naval defeat in their attempt to invade and occupy Great Britain. Not only would the victorious Spanish have divided all of the land and wealth, but done so with the stated objective of destroying Protestant power in England and bringing Elizabeth to Rome for a public burning. Now, the Spanish failed in the process that captains failed to learn in the process that the captains of FedEx shipments of stolen New World gold and Manila galleons filled with Far Eastern riches were not automatically qualified to be captains of war vessels. With a little help from the weather, the Limeys managed to fight off the invasion and drive it to self-destruction against its North Sea escape route. At any rate, the Iberian road to riches stood and in direct contrast to the British way. In the United Kingdom, the profit center involved producing commodities for sale at home and abroad. The British had to go the cap route because they were locked out of the Western Hemisphere. The New World was Spanish until the 1588 debacle. Afterwards, the British, Dutch, and French military challenged the Spanish monarchs, but by that time, the Protestants had gone the capitalist route. And initially, it had been far less profitable, but like it or not, in those pre-1588 days, the capitalist route was their only route, supplemented along the way with a lot of piracy, which they call buccaneering, or if you prefer, privateering in the Caribbean, as well as exploration with a view to colonization of the Indian subcontinent. And for an entertaining view of this Caribbean period, I recommend the Gina Davis 1995 movie Cutthroat Island. That movie is based loosely on the adventures of several female pirates, which of some renown, and one socialist pirate who ended up in Madagascar. It gives a technically correct view of the British New World in 1668, which was only the Caribbean and New England. Australia and New Zealand were not yet discovered, and another recent Starz series is Black Sails, which gives an excellent view of life in Nassau that was the prime Brit privateer base. For an excellent view of the latter part of this 400-year period, that is until 1810, I recommend the A&E series Horatio Hornblower and the more recent Russell Crowe movie Master and Commander, Far Side of the World, that illustrates the condition of terminal feudalism and early capitalism in Europe's Napoleonic Wars, as does the 17-part Richard Sharp TV series written by Bernard Cornwell. And I spent years in Nassau, Bahamas at one time studying this history. Anyway, unbeknownst even to themselves, in the end, the British and the French were on the far better road to super profit creation via capitalism than the Spanish. It took history 400 years to catch up with the Spanish, and even so it's an interesting dialectical conundrum, for while the Spanish path aimed as it was at avoiding class antagonisms known to be associated in the rest of Western Europe with capitalism of the industrial variety, which might have generated a fatal weakness in their system, in the short run, it was simultaneously weakening Spain via England and France in the long run. As the nature of West European and North American economy began to shift to manufacturing, even ever so marginally at first, the shift was simultaneously being made into whose hands actual cash and commodities were accumulated. No longer was the ruling class source of wealth the farmers held in servitude as serfs or slaves in Eastern Europe, but the workers paid by the hour. Thus the capitalists were without the additional burden of having to feed and house their labor force, which if held in absolute servitude would have to be fed and housed all year round. Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, notes this fact on page 1 of that book. He points out that the capitalist route was the much more economical one. This is still why capitalist wage slavery is the normative preference over chattel slavery. Now the owner of the means of production simply dismissed labor when no longer needed. Those dismissed are on their own. Serfs and slaves have to be fed and housed all year round by their masters and mistresses. Workers for wages were, and are, fucked after working hours. Freedom is not free. Constant struggle for schools and health care is required. Thus, over a period of several centuries, the hand of the manufacturing and financial bourgeoisie grew until they became the determining factor in Anglo-American politics. Thanks, but no thanks. In those 4 centuries, from 1518 to 1921, the feudal ruling classes considered Spanish industrialization at home in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon to be completely out of the question. And why was that? Because they knew the emergence of mercantile capitalists possessing commodities created by proto-machinofacture with its essential use of labor power as the source of all wealth in their factories, that they would also be creating their own gravediggers. First of all, the creation of an industrial proletariat would be terribly destabilizing, industrial workers being far more difficult to control than landless agricultural workers. And secondly, some of the small bourgeoisie would become big bourgeoisie quickly, and many of them would be financially very well off. Inevitably, this would mean the king and his court, not to mention the nobility, would soon come under their sway by becoming their lenders and bankers, as their class brothers had in every other European country. Thus the Iberian monarchs decided for industry they might have to have, and for profits that came from the creation of capitalist proto-commodities, they would grab as grab can in the rest of Western Europe. "We'll take capitalism our way, thank you," is what they had to say. This is why, in the second half of the 1500s, Philip Spain took military aim at the Netherlands and England, and earlier, in a more sophisticated way, Isabel had taken aim at the workshops of Italy, bribing the voting cardinals to install her lover, the infamous Archbishop Rodrigo Borgia, as Pope of Rome. Then after that, he changed his name to Alexander VI. Meanwhile, Spain's resources were devoted to the tiny ruling class behind these monarchs, which is to say their luxurious lifestyles, and to the construction of a powerful naval force to control these new global provinces. By placing capitalism in its true form outside the boundaries of Castile and Aragon, the Spanish feudalist rulers secured the labor and social peace they wanted at home and for a long time. There was no need for public education here, beyond the guilds necessary to construct powerful Manila galleons. So the early start the Spaniards had made in terms of education was reversed. The reversal lasted nearly 4 centuries. It featured a steady decline in public education, including higher education, where 60-odd universities were reduced to 15. Lower grade education was handed to the religious authorities of Roman Catholicism, so that so-called public education in Iberia resembled so-called public education in the contemporary Islamic world. For the powers that be, the ruling aristocrats and their nobility, it was a system which had worked very well. If it had not been for the U.S. declaration of war against them in 1898, as far as they were concerned, being ignorant and blind to history, the old regime could have gone forever. Spain was forced into the 20th century, however, in the War of 1898 against the North Americans, and this brought a new day to the Iberian Peninsula, at least in the Spanish part of it. The gringos wanted the Spanish road into China. This they got when they defeated the pitiful naval squadrons of the Spanish and seized the Philippines. The Cuban part of this Spanish-North American War was just an excuse. Intervention there had to happen that year unless the gringos were ready to let Cuba win its independence on its own merits, given the advances of the Cuban revolutionary forces of Jose Marti. Now, the Philippines had been the major road into China for Europeans for all of these 4 centuries, and in the 1500s and 1600s, the only road. The gringos wanted it, they knew they could seize it, and proceeded to do so. And a fascinating insight into the status of Europe with the Far East in 1600 is James Clavell's book Shogun and movie series. But at any rate, the loss of the Philippines to the U.S. meant large numbers of de facto expelled overseas Spanish expatriate capitalists who would make their way back to their homeland, and they brought with them the technology of capitalism they had been using to create profits overseas. Therefore, in the early 1900s, the arrival of Spain's foreign expatriate capitalists and their new class technocrats doomed Spain's old order. 20 years later, however, the old regime would not go quietly, so Spain became the center in the 1920s of an intense intra-bourgeoisie struggle and an intra-feudal classes struggle. These struggles were intense precisely because the returnees would not wait. Too many years had gone by already. The idea of waiting was dead on arrival. The newcomers wanted modern government and modern property concepts as they understood them to go along with their technology and would not take no or later for an answer. Realistically, how could they take no or later for an answer when their entire way of earning a living depended on industrial manufacturing? The returning expatriate capitalists linked up with like-minded Spaniards at home. The feudalist monarchy would have to give way to a capitalist parliamentary system, where the bourgeoisie could settle their differences among themselves. Now, these struggles were exacerbated simultaneously by an increasingly aggressive working-class movement in the towns and cities and in the countryside. So what would happen? Beginning in 1931, with the election of a parliament and the abdication of the king, Spain began a downward spiral toward civil war that climaxed on July 17, 1936. That was the date of the revolt of the Spanish fascist army officers against the newly elected Popular Front government of the Republic. In other words, the fascist revolt was a direct response to the election of a communist-encouraged Popular Front government. They won, we lost, and why? The reality was that the elected parliament was definitely radical, and it was just as clearly not a communist government. If it had been a Bolshevik government, such as we had in Russia after October 1917, the way the Spanish War could have been conducted would have been entirely different. The truth was that the Spanish ruling classes had assumed the worst, which was us in power, and struck a preventive first blow. The reality was that we Bolsheviks had helped place in power in Madrid a Mickey Mouse coalition of incompetent boobs. In the end, the Spanish ruling families were right to do, from their perspective, what they did, because we could not stop them. Even after over 2.5 years of civil war, even when world fascism was destroyed in 1945, the Spanish ruling families continued in power in Spain for the rest of their lives. In fact, they are still in power, albeit for many years under a social democratic facade. Now in 2018, Spaniards are rediscovering the lessons of their own civil war, namely that capitalist government is at bottom another servitude epic dictatorship. The only answer to the present crisis is working-class communist revolution. Remember this as one more lesson about social democracy. It is just a cover, better called social fascism, that always betrays workers in the last analysis. Now, the working class factor in Spain. Anarchism, perhaps the most pernicious anti-working class ideology then operating in Europe, had had success in northern Italy, Russia, and Spain during the 1800s. It was such a serious threat to proper working class ideology that General Secretary Karl Marx sent the first international of working men away from Europe to the USA. In the U.S., the then, that is 1876, 19 chapters of North American Communist First International Workers dissolved it altogether, as Marx had wished, and went on to create their own Working Men's Party of the USA. However, in Spain, the anarchists had created a following among the oppressed masses of landless agricultural workers in places like Catalonia and Andalusia. In North America, think of the Grange and its agrarian radicalism over the last century, and you will have an idea of what this kind of thinking amounts to. Although in North America, the farmers involved were far better off than those who had literally nothing in Spain. The rural political idiocy of the European illiterate and thus uneducated peasant farmers shines through. The anarchist tradition among the landless agricultural laborers of Spain provided the base upon which the trade union form of anarchism could and did build as the returning capitalists began creating factories in Catalonia and Andalusia. One can see what Karl Marx called the idiocy of rural, poor, ignorant, peasant, landless worker life. The only relationship these oppressed masses had had with any state, that is army and police, for 6,000 years was being the subject of insatiable tax collecting. Their rulers insisted upon this extreme, unjust extortion. The rulers accompanied this extortion with a host of inhuman indignities applied to those they considered lower than farm animals. The idea that the state, that is the army and police, any state, is the source of all evil, found easy acceptance among this mass of dehumanized poor. This is all the mass base of anarchism is in reality. That is all it has ever been. Mature intellectuals here and everywhere should already have learned this, and most have. However, there are still those around too lazy to undertake a scientific study of history. Marx and Engels proved what the state is, and archaeology has confirmed that judgment. Now, the lay of the land. From 1902 to 1909, Spanish anarchist leaders built a following among the industrial proletariat, emerging in the new capitalist factories originating in this rural hell. These are the Anarcho-Syndicalists, syndicate being another then popular term for unions. In 1909, they created their first national trade union called CNT, which stands for Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, or National Work Confederation. Syndicalism is the theory that workers can take control of a nation simply by taking control of shops, factories, farms, and other enterprises without first confronting and destroying the bourgeois state. Now, Marxism was not without adherents in Spain. It had its own union called the UGT, the General Workers' Union. With the return of the expatriate capitalists, it began to grow rapidly. Proper Marxism, that is Bolshevism, calls for armed confrontation with the capitalist state and its destruction before workers can proceed to construct socialism. Nevertheless, there are Marxists and there are Marxists. It was not until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 that correct Marxism, that is Leninism, the PCE, Partido Comunista de España, really took off, jumping from perhaps only 10,000 members in 1918 to 200,000 members by 1919. It was, however, still quite small compared to the 700,000 members in the anarchist CNT that year. In the succeeding decade, the UGT grew to 1 million members, as did the CNT, and the landless agricultural workers were a larger class still at over 2 million. Now, the UGT was still quite divided, that is, revisionists versus revolutionaries, in terms of socialist objectives, and had, of course, an underlying strong trade union issues orientation. Now, as 1936 dawned, the CPSU-B, General Line, that is, Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, General Line, thus the common term General Line, had only the very small Spanish Communist Party, PCE, representing it in Spain. Against that stood not only just this massive anarchist problem, but the additional complication of real Trotskyists and a plethora of so-called independent Marxist groups, among them the de facto Trotskyist ultra-left party called POUM, that stands for Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. Its leader was Trotsky's former personal secretary, Andres Nin. Now finally there was the Socialist Party of Spain, the principal party of the UGT. In 1936, Stalin wanted it allied with the Communist Party of Spain, the PCE. Now the Socialist Party leader furthest to the left was a man named Francisco Largo Caballero. He had taken the title of the Spanish Lenin, but he was far from that. Largo Caballero did not want to unify with the communists. Combined with other failings, this led to his early replacement as the Civil War unfolded. In May 1937, after the siege of Madrid was lifted and our international brigades had led the counterattack, throwing the fascist forces and their 150,000 Italian troop allies well back on their heels, Largo Caballero was tossed out as Prime Minister of the Spanish Republic and replaced by Dr. Juan Negrin. The truth is, there was no Spanish Lenin, nor could the communists make one out of the raw material available, which included the best of the Spanish Marxists, such as Dolores Ibárruri. Stalin knew this and had sent his favorite Chicist, Alexander Orlov, to make a personal tour of the Spanish situation in the spring of 1936. And we went over some of this in the last lecture. Now, Orlov left behind a working cadre of Chekists in key cities to support the Republic should Stalin decide to do what he was thinking about in April and May of 1936. Stalin did decide to act by way of sending volunteers and instructed Orlov to make up for lost developmental time in what might otherwise have been a typical party-building exercise in a de facto third world or colonial type of country. Orlov did his best, but in the end, nothing the Soviets did could turn Spain into a country with a unified working class and Leninist leadership in the short time available. Now, the technological and political status of Spanish capitalism was one thing we want to take note of. Spanish capitalist technological applications were not restricted to mining and agriculture. They were making rapid inroads in far more complex technological areas such as aircraft construction. For example, the Spanish steel complex, an auto manufacturer, Hispano-Suiza, built the best airplane engine of the entire First World War in prototype form. Now, the actual construction shifted immediately to the advanced capitalist countries for use in the air war of that great conflict of 1914 to 1918. Spain did not have the manufacturing capability yet at that time to produce aircraft by mass production, but it definitely had the corps of scientists and engineers from which such capability could be built. In the years after World War I, Spanish capital and its workers got on with that job. However, in the 30 years following the end of the U.S.-Spanish War, the returning expatriate Spanish capitalists had had an insufficient amount of time to come up with a unified national political solution to their problems. As we have seen, these were problems peculiar to the stunted developmental road Spain had been following for 4 centuries. Now, the new would-be rulers had to confront the socio-cultural consequences of problems that face any nation undergoing rapid social and cultural evolution, not to mention this specific developmental inheritance. That 4-century historical interregnum of national technological stagnation acted to drag the entire nation behind as it attempted to hothouse its way into the modern capitalist world. As in China, the criminal element rescued capitalism. Meyer Lansky, Big-Eared Du, and Chiang Kai-shek had a new equal. His name was Juan March. Juan Alberto March Ordonez. Juan March was born on 4 October 1880 and died on the 10th of March 1962. He was a Spanish gangster and legal businessman who financed the fascist side of the Spanish Civil War. After the war, he was a prime mover in the regime of Francisco Franco. Juan March became the wealthiest man in Spain and the 6th richest man in the world. The March family is among the richest in the world, reported to be worth over $150 billion today. Born in Santa Margalida on the island of Mallorca, he smuggled tobacco from North Africa into Spain. During World War I, he supplied goods to both sides, evading the Allied blockade of the Central Powers and the German U-boats. His power and influence increased under different Spanish governments during the reign of King Alfonso XIII. In 1926, he created the Banca March in Mallorca. In 1930, the monarchy was replaced by the Second Spanish Republic. March lost his influence and was convicted and imprisoned for his illegal dealings. He paid to escape from prison and fled to Gibraltar, and there his influence with the British government protected him against extradition. In 1926, he created the Banca March in Mallorca. In 1930, the monarchy was replaced by the Spanish Second Republic, and in 1936, March financed the war against the Republic. He arranged Franco's flight from the Canary Islands to Spanish Morocco. He brought the colonial troops there into the rebellion and personally financed the Italian airlift of those troops to southern Spain. In 1939, with the fascist victory, March regained all of his former influence. He was the most favored capitalist of the Franco regime. During World War II, the Allies employed him to keep Spain from joining the Axis. In 1941, according to recently declassified documents, the British government gave him US $10 million with which to bribe the top Spanish generals. And at any rate, in 1944, March became a supporter of the claim of Don Juan de Bourbon, who had turned pro-Allies, to the Spanish throne. He owned newspapers devoted to Franco. In 1945, he was the 7th richest man in the world. In 1955, he established the Juan March Foundation, and it still supports fascism in Spain. Juan March was married to Leonor Cervera. They had 2 children, and then I give the rest of the details of that family today. Now, coming back to the death of a king, Wallace Simpson Stalin and Beria in March of 1936. And Stalin is speaking when he says, Lavrenti, what I am about to tell you is known only to me and two men in the Red Army intelligence. When we were in China in force, Red Army G2, that is GRU, recruited a number of English-speaking agents. One of them is an American woman named Wallace Simpson. She came to us via North American communist Anna Louise Strong, while a high-class prostitute in Shanghai. Actually, Lev, as I recall, she has had as many names as we do, but in her case it's because she's had so many lovers and husbands. At any rate, the latest man in her career is the Prince of Wales. To which Beria responds and interjects, the new king. Yes, Stalin said, this piece of shit is going to be coronated by May of next year, that is 1937. Now that the funeral of the old king is completed, there will be 40,000 invitees, so it will take a while to put it together. Now that gives us a little time. The problem is, this guy is an outright Nazi, a personal friend of Hitler, and he acts as a German agent in his own country. This makes this particular royal reactionary unacceptable to us. This is exactly what we do not want. Now the British Prime Minister Baldwin is engineering a plot against us of his own, and the class behind him currently does not want to go to war with us, with Hitler at its head. And I do not want them to change their mind because of this new cocksucker on the throne. So what is the answer? In this case, because we have Prince David Edward VIII's girlfriend on our payroll, it seems to me we should be able to get him to abdicate, hopefully before his coronation. Fortunately, the Baldwin clique hates him, and I want you to run her in such a way as to make her multiple previous marriages an unacceptable issue over which Baldwin will force this new king to do that, that is, to abdicate. Now, how exactly would this be done? And Stalin continues, the prince is all fucked up sexually just like all the Brit aristocrats and completely subject to fetish manipulation. This is how she hooked him. He will give up the throne rather than his daily sexual excesses, which at any rate could not be easily satisfied elsewhere for a whole bunch of reasons. Am I amusing you? And Beria said, I'm laughing because I never dreamed such a thing was going on and probably wouldn't have believed it if you hadn't told me. Yes, I could get her to continue to take him down the fetish road to Roman decadence, if everything checks out in the file. Koba, as usual, you caught me by surprise with this, but I don't need to know who they are. But I do need to know if there are other Army intel agents in England that the Chica does not know about. This will be important consideration in planning. Yes, but I think we should run her as an individual agent with a specialized control. Of course, and G2 will know about the others, so we won't step on any toes. Stalin says, now this is the only copy in existence of her file. Take it with you, brief yourself, and then link up with the GRU generals. I want it back and not copied. Lev, I know you can do this, and you're the only one I trust to take over this project. Now that asshole Yagoda I've already blocked from working with any of our networks in West Europe, and I certainly would not want him, or any other Chica under his leadership, or anyone else's for that matter, to know anything else about this. I understand, and I will take care of it. I promise you their new king will resign. Thank you, Lev. Now, as an historical note, the king did abdicate on December 11th, 1936. For insight into what Wallace Simpson confronted in Shanghai in her earlier days, I recommend the 2005 movie The White Countess with Ralph Fiennes and Natasha Richardson. At any rate, British collaboration with fascism in the decade from 1926 to 1936 was deep and involved the plotting to overthrow the Soviet government, as it was possible to be. By 1936, this led to outright support for fascism in its various forms, although in ways more subtle than sending troops. Its new, blatant pro-fascist foreign policy began in Spain. Now, after 1936, British and French ruling oligarchs would continue to try and get the Germans to take the point, right up until they were either overcome, as the French were in 1940, or until after Hitler had first taken them to the mat, as he did with the UK, also in 1940. Their policy, in short, was to attack the USSR once the Brit and French ruling cap families could get Germany to take the point. Now, the strategy of the ruling class conservative Tory party was to manipulate events to come up with a London-Berlin-Rome axis. What had thrown Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and his successor Neville Chamberlain a curve was the unexpected ascent of Hitler to power in January of 1933. Now, the reason this ascent of one king from another had thrown them into a tizzy was because the minority section of the British ruling class was cravenly pro-Nazi and led by this new king, Edward VIII. In his short pre-coronation time on the throne, this new king, who would last less than 1 year, had threatened Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in March of 1936 with abdication should Baldwin go to war against Germany for any reason. At that critical moment, this had been because Hitler had just militarily seized the Alsace-Lorraine region on the French border. Now, Baldwin represented the majority section of the ruling capitalist families in England, and they did not want to go to war with Russia with Hitler at the head of Germany. They had no use for this new king's idea of restoring total monarchy as in the years before the coming of Cromwell. Cromwell was their greatest, most terrifying class memory. In 1940, as the Duke of Windsor, at the outset of World War II, David performed the ultimate treason. He provided Hitler with the British and French defensive plans, allowing the Germans to break through by circumventing the Maginot Line and striking through the weakest front of French defenses. At the time, the traitor Duke was on the British General Staff in Paris, preparing the joint defense of France from Nazi invasion. Britain never had a greater traitor than this Windsor king. The Duke's brother, George VI, an always stupid king of England, sent one of our agents, Anthony Blunt, to search for and destroy his brother David's 1930s and 1940s letters to the Nazis. The sitting King George VI believed they were in possession of Windsor relatives in Germany. Blunt was then number 4 in what MI6 called the Ring of Five. The Crown was forced to admit this under Margaret Thatcher. Now, the Windsor treason might still be bad enough in the public mind to damn the entire royal family. Accordingly, today's masters of propaganda have created sympathy for the moron George VI in the recent hit movie The King's Speech with Colin Firth, Geoffrey Rush, and Helena Bonham Carter, the latter of the famous Bonham Carter political family. At any rate, Blunt went right into Germany following the American and British troops as they entered Nazi Germany. Whatever he found was taken directly to King George VI of England and, of course, to Joseph Stalin. I assumed this would have made Stalin laugh his ass off. Now, of course, Stalin had known about David and his Nazi plotting for many years. The British ruler's allergy to Cromwell and the English Revolution of 1640 to 1680 stopped an immediate joint capitalist attack on the USSR. When one sets aside what was in their minds, the ideological nonsense, it was clear to Baldwin and the great majority of Britain's wealthiest families that Hitler was another Cromwell. That they could not yet stomach. After all, Cromwell had almost finished them off. He had abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords. Now, Alexander Orlov kept Stalin apprised of the machinations of Baldwin's cabinet and Edward's rancid court via his spies Philby, Burgess, Maclean, Blunt, and Cairncross. Meanwhile, in Spain, the billionaire boss of criminal bosses and the Spanish fascist chieftain Juan March was sufficiently encouraged by Britain's de facto collaboration with Hitler over the Alsace-Lorraine, he authorized the armed revolt. March provided the finance for Spanish fascism and gave the go-ahead for Spanish fascist army officers to rise again, and that fascist revolt began in July on the 17th in 1936. Now, Stalin, because of his spies, had anticipated this development and had dispatched Orlov to Spain in March of 36 to prepare the way for indirect intervention when the time came. The Chicas in charge of Iberia had kept Stalin apprised of the secret fascist conspiracy to overthrow the moderate bourgeois Madrid regime. He knew it was only a matter of time until the plot was brought to fruition. Now, Stalin wanted to put up resistance to the fascists in Spain for a variety of reasons. However, he could not officially send the Red Army. He would have to rely on Orlov's organizing partisan and perhaps regular warfare along the lines of what he had done for Stalin in Russia's Civil War. Orlov had a working network of agents, and Stalin followed up with disguised Soviet pilots, tank crews, and then infantry. A large supply of infantry he pumped in through international volunteers. These became the international brigades. When the fascist conspirators succeeded in moving their army from North Africa to the peninsula, Stalin's men were not far behind. Stalin knew the delicate nature of the work in Spain, and accordingly he pulled Orlov out of his British and other West European responsibilities and gave him sole command of Soviet operations in Spain in August of 1936. So by the time Juan March gave the order on July 17th to overthrow the Republican government in Madrid, Stalin had his organization in place in Spain barely. That is by July 30, 1936. And within weeks, international volunteers began to show up along with Soviet troops and weapons. For them and for us, as the rubber met the asphalt, as they say, it would be a chance to do a little ass-kicking. Now, another inside snapshot on Stalin's decision of August 2nd, 1936. It was a broiling Moscow summer day in early August, the 2nd of 1936. Joseph Stalin, in military uniform, was pacing in front of the door leading to the foyer of his Staraya Street office, awaiting the arrival of his European spy boss, Alexander M. Orlov, that is, Lev Feldman. Now, his secretary, Alexander N. Poskorabyshev, announced the arrival of Stalin's closest associate and Prime Minister, fellow Politburo member Vyacheslav Vlad Molotov, and seconds later, Orlov. Now, Molotov examined the map of Spain someone from Stalin's secretariat had set up in the center of the room minutes earlier. Stalin bear-hugged the entering NKVD general. "Thank goodness you're back, Lev. Koba, it's always wonderful to see you again, and you too, Vlad. We have as much time as you wish. Now go ahead and brief me on Spain." Stalin continued to stand as Orlov went to the map and began as follows, quote, "Following the instructions you gave me, I proceeded under alias to Barcelona, and then visited our party leaders in each of the cities you specified. Along the way, I deposited our Spanish-speaking intelligence officers and a small staff in each of these locales. Now, of course, we have shortwave contact with all of them, and we are now in position to do whatever we may be ordered to do next. As for the situation in general, it's a mixed bag. On the positive side, the Republican government controls the center and most populated portion of the country. It has an excellent armored force, good aircraft, and an outstanding navy. Furthermore, the working class is uniformly anti-fascist and totally committed to volunteer labor to the degree necessary to man the war industries. Premier among these industries is the Hispano-Suiza industrial complex. On the negative side, the problem area is already clear, and that is an even normal military education is unavailable to what will have to be a new generation of Army officers. Almost all officers field grade and above, which is major and above, are fascist traitors and have now to be replaced. Not that this is the worst of it. The anarchist, syndicalist, Trotskyite, and other ultra-left Marxist nutballs are a far more serious problem. They have fractionated portions of the working class where they have an apparatus. Our own party is still quite small, but that will change if we intervene along the lines you indicated you were considering a few months ago. On the other hand, it may be too late for us to turn the tide with our volunteer forces, although I think it's now a matter of timing. If we intervene quickly, we may be able to save the Republicans, at least for the moment. Our prestige and that of our correspondent party will increase enormously. In short, if the Republicans lose, it will be because of the ultra-left crackpot ideas that have infected the Army, by which I mean all its bullshit about soldiers' committees, direct election, and worst of all, direct recall of officers and NCOs. As usual, the ultra-left has learned nothing from our experiences in our own Civil War. My recommendation is that we force the imposition of clarity on the left. They must be made to accept the advances in the organization of the people as a whole in the form of their own revolutionary, if not red, army. Inevitably, we will have to convince the Republican leaders to liquidate the entire ultra-left before it can completely infect and thereby totally destroy the Republican resistance, or we'll have to do it ourselves. Normally used to cover maps for tracing the old Bolsheviks, have gotten used to using transparent paper to plan battle tactics, and Orlov pulled down on a transpaper paper rolled tight above the map of Spain and drew a line with a red crayon and then several black crayon circles. Now on the map, this is what the current disposition of forces of both the Republicans and the fascist order of battle looks like. These are the danger points. A seizure of Madrid could be the checkmate in 4 moves that would end this war before it really gets started. Now, to prevent this collapse from occurring and to prepare a decent war plan for 1937, we would have to do, at the minimum, the following. Now, Orlov then handed a copy of his eyes-only final report, the only copy, to Stalin directly, who took it to his desk and placed it squarely in front of the chair he would eventually assume when resuming his desk work. As the fundamental decisions are yours and the Politburo's, I want to raise the question of whether it's worth it to invest the time and treasure necessary to secure this rather primitive country's left government. Even if they win, they will require huge amounts of foreign assistance or develop investment, however you want to look at it. Whether this is worth it when we are struggling to prepare for the inevitable coming world war here at home should be, I think, the central question. And finally, I don't think Yagoda is up to this. I've had nothing but trouble with him over our European operations, and he is completely out of his depth. It's bad enough we have to keep him out of the UK altogether. In Spain, we cannot afford one fuck-up. Now, Koba, I'm ready to answer specific questions. And Stalin replied, "First, Lev, let me thank you for your wonderful work. You've always made me proud. And while I have made many mistakes over the years, appointing you Chief of European Intelligence was certainly not one of them. Quite the opposite. While you were taking care of business so brilliantly in Spain, I have been confronting a rapidly escalating international situation that has required the kinds of critical decisions you refer to, and I'll bring you up to speed. As you know, Baldwin gave Hitler Alsace-Lorraine in March. Now that was their signal to Germany that England did not oppose their territorial readjustment ideas. This, of course, includes Hitler's long-promised attack on us. It may be that the civil war in Spain is going to be the critical test to the Germans as to whether they are ready for war with us. Now, we have to bloody their nose in Spain for our own good. There's also the fact that the Spanish can pay for our assistance. They have perhaps 1,000 tons of gold in their treasury, and we could take as equity against the cost of armaments, and which we could use. However, dialectically, it's definitely a great risk for us to get involved in Spain. You can be sure that the ruling oligarchy of capitalists in England and France will try and terrify their own bourgeoisie, especially their petty bourgeoisie, with the specter of a Red Army invasion of Spain. They want to join with Hitler and Mussolini for a combined attack on us. As you know, it's only the Brits' desire to remove Hitler and put in a government in Berlin more amenable to their anti-Cromwellian prejudices, which has so far delayed the Baldwin plot for a London-Berlin-Rome axis against us. On the other hand, I need and must have combat specifications on reliability, firepower, armor, speed, and most importantly, producibilities for our new main battle tanks. And we need all kinds of specs for our aircraft. This mess in Spain gives us the objective conditions for such combat testing. On the other hand, as I just explained, we certainly cannot send the Red Army, nor the Red Navy, but we can send entire military units in civilian clothes and then put them into Republican uniforms for their tank force and air force. What we can do openly is to send international volunteers. The first contingent of these will be primarily our best Soviet youth. Nevertheless, the international force should emphasize the non-communist, anti-fascist youth from the major countries that will have gone to Spain to fight fascism. We are to be seen as a good friend and partner in the spirit of the United Front Against Fascism adopted last year by the Comintern Congress. Stalin's reference was to the 7th Comintern Congress held in 1935. Now, I can and will send our modern tanks and warplanes and the crews to man them, but again, they will have Republican markings, and their drivers, crews, and pilots will wear Republican uniforms. As you send back data on machinery performance, I will see that we update the engineers in the design institutes and get the changes and modifications performed super quickly. Oh yes, you, Lev, you are taking over in Spain. I will provide you with a blank check on Chicas. You should pick the staff you want while you're here to take with you and appoint permanent liaison officers to secure a continuing flow of men and materiel from the Soviet Union to the Spanish Republic. I will see to it that they get 100% support here. Now it's up to you to see that they are properly deployed in the war zone, and this should be child's play for you, as it is a replay of what we did together in the Civil War, Lev, and especially as you disrupted the Polish capitalist feudalist armies in 1920. Now the Spaniards have the money to pay for our support, so I expect them to use it. If they did not, we would of course pay the bill. However, since they do have it, and as you properly point out, we are in a life and death struggle to industrialize before the next worldwide assault of the capitalists against us, they should use it. Now this money is in the form of hundreds of tons of gold and silver, the remnants of their rape of the New World. That day will come when I will tell them through Ambassador Rosenthal to send that gold here for safekeeping and for security against the cost of our military support. However, you have to take charge of that personally, Lev, and as for Yagoda, I will replace him. Now before you go to get things together, I want you to come with me to the Kremlin. I have a visiting party delegation from the United States. I want you to meet them. We'll take advantage of the opportunity to talk and grab a bite to eat along the way. The boss was always thinking several steps ahead. So in 1937 and the Spanish War unfolded, Stalin began the purge and reorganization of both the Red Army and its supporting military-industrial complex. Spain turned out to be the most important training ground for the new Red Army officer corps, including the elite Marshals Council, and producing 40 new generals from the upcoming field-grade officers. Many future high-ranking officers fought in Spain as lieutenants and captains. 40 new generals from 1 to 4 stars and rear admirals were promoted from this corps of blooded combat officers who had volunteered for Spain. Of those, some were critically acclaimed for their conduct during the coming Second World War. And our Secret Service heroes did their portion also. Take a look at Kim Philby, who looked more Windsor than the Windsors. Average 2 tall in height, cool and clear blue eyes, blonde hair, perfectly slim and fit physically, ladies' man, proper pedigree, perfect manner, proper educational background from beginning to end, and high marks to go with it. Now he was in Saragossa at the Maria Isabel, the finest hotel in that city, in 1937. Philby had been sending reports from Burgos since February of 37, and by May, thanks to his father and Orloff, had been made the Times official correspondent, attached to the fascist Falangist Party's forces, now unified under General Francisco Franco. His editors turned out to be thrilled, as he had provided the Times and its editors the prestige which had evaded them for some time for balanced and fair coverage of the continental fascist right. Now Philby had the ability to write reports that made Spanish fascism seem enlightened, and more importantly, invincible. It was the better part of valor, no matter what political position a Tory happened to take on the matter of fascism in general, to see the wisdom in supporting this particular fascist. General Francisco Franco, even the Tory anti-Nazi maverick Winston Churchill found Philby, quote, objective, convincing, and probably right, unquote. Now Philby's dispatches always mentioned Franco's concern for common people, his perfect credit rating, and the normalcy of life in Falangist-controlled parts of Spain. Not to mention the always perfect maintaining of law and order. Now, in 1937, Philby had insisted that only the Chica's in-country Iberian chief provide him with what he needed to know. He, in turn, could provide what the Chica men needed to know to carry out sabotage and killing missions. After his recruitment into MI6 in 1940, Philby was acting as chief of his own recruited team of Spanish shooters, thus eliminating the need to use the 00 men, and Philby was paying for it with a generous Chica budget, although MI6 had no idea. Even so, his 1937-38 lone wolf track record in Spain and Portugal provided the cover for him to do the same thing on a larger scale when MI6 would send him back to Iberia as their agent. It was a freebie for London HQ. M appreciated any budgetary relief with so many tasks for the 00 section to be accomplished elsewhere. Now, Ian Fleming, a former MI6 agent and scion of one of Britain's wealthiest families and James Bond novels author, so indoctrinated everyone with his terminology, I'm using it, but will explain where appropriate the real terminology, as I believe I mentioned last time. In this case, 00 stands for the real term licensed, meaning licensed to kill. M was actually C, as you will see in the pre-Bond era Graham Greene novel and movie Our Man in Havana, starring Alex Kiddis. On his own, and completely without the Chica's knowledge, originally provided by Orlov at Molotov's private direction, Beria's organization had a special section of the Chica called SMERSH. That was the Russian acronym for Smert Spionum, death to spies. It had secreted a radio system in an invulnerable position. In 1937, Philby would use it as necessary, which would be hardly at all. Philby's job was not to provide intelligence to the Red Secret Service, but to build his own credentials for a mission still years away, unless, of course, he should run across information that needed to go to Comrade Stalin immediately. Thus, the radio contact with the Kremlin was direct and available. Cutting out Yezhov and all of Moscow Central, Philby routinely reported in 1937 in Spain directly to Orlov. Then, with Orlov's 1938 reassignment, Philby reported to Beria and Molotov, and even directly to Stalin when exigent circumstances required it. And for more on this, you can see Molotov's autobiography, Molotov Remembers. Now, Philby needed a constant flow of accurate data about many things Moscow Central did not need to know he knew. A Spanish librarian, controlled directly by Molotov, which is to say Stalin, provided this to him on a regular basis. She had impeccable Spanish aristocratic cousin-class credentials. She was without any left contacts whatsoever in her own culture, and when Stalin wanted Kim to know certain highly sensitive background information, it was provided to her, and through Moscow rules, she fed it to him when he appeared at her library. In turn, when he asked for specific information, she transferred the request on her own radio, and if an answer were forthcoming, Philby would pick it up at his next review of the daily Spanish press, which was available on a daily basis to hundreds of eager readers, of which to spying eyes, he was only one more. Now, as you can see, the situation in Spain was fraught with danger for the international working class movement in general, and the USSR in particular. A mistake of any kind, even a seemingly small one, could be disastrous, leading to world war. Worse, a world war with all the cap countries on one side, and the USSR, the People's Republic of Mongolia, and the Red Base areas in China on the other. After the battle for Madrid stabilized successfully for the Republic in May of 1937, Stalin, who had taken direct command of all Spanish operations of the Comintern and placed Orlov in direct command on the ground, now began a purge of the Chica's foreign operations with the aim of making it a more reliable tool. Stalin knew he could not continue to run each of the rapidly increasing number of Orlov super agents, accepting the Magnificent Five and Richard Sorga on a personal basis. That meant the Chica management of its foreign operations had to be brought up to speed. However, Could the managerial hardware of the Chica be returned to the same high level it had exhibited under Felix Dzerzhinsky? Now the answer turned out to be yes, but it was a process rather than a happening, and it started like this. Now this is an inside snapshot from April 1937. Quote, "Thank you, Vlad, for filling in." Molotov automatically arose from the boss's chair and stood to the side waiting to hear the outcome of what had just gone before. "Fucking asshole. I can't believe Callanan was so drunk that he fell down and had to be removed from the stage. Can you imagine how that affected all those school teachers?" And Molotov said, "Well, I'm sure you put it straight. I did, but it took all morning. Now, I'm glad I went. Only the Army is more important to us than these teachers who have the minds of our youth in their custody. Fortunately, the bullshit propaganda campaign turning me into a superhero worked to take their minds off of Callanan, the president of the Soviet Union, and onto me. I got us past the debacle of that drunk on the stage, and as importantly, I got a real feel for their problems. They are a loyal and dedicated bunch, and they need more money, and we have to get it to them." "Yes, sir, I'll get on it now. Any specific recommendations?" "A mountain of them. Poskrebishov has the book. Now, Molotov, this Callanan thing cannot happen again. From now on, for the rest of his fucking presidency, he'll be watched 24 hours a day, and the first time he has a drink, he'll be taken to the Lubyanka." "I understand." Now, the boss sitting at his desk grabbed a telephone to his right and punched a familiar button. "Beria, put the president in a hospital. Not a regular hospital. He'll intimidate the doctors as soon as he sobers up and wants another bottle. And he'll leave a place like that. Arrest him, put him in a rehab, and do not let him out until I say so, and keep me informed." "Yes, Koba, consider it done." Now the boss hung up. "Now what were you saying about what happened to Philby?" "Oh, okay, he was detained with his code on tissue paper in his pocket at the Great Admiral Hotel in Cordova, about 30 kilometers from the Seville front. Now he was able to eat it, or he would be dead by now. It was just an accident as far as we can determine. An overzealous Franco policeman brought him in, even though he had a right to be there, and had checked ahead of time at Seville with Franco's cops just to be sure. Anyway, he's out of pocket until we can replace his code instructions. Burgess is on his way to Gibraltar now. They will connect, and eventually he will be back online. And in the meantime, he's laying low and doing his job for the Times. We still have our radio contact. But Koba, that's not all. Yazov seems to think you want Philby to get close to Franco and kill him." "What? I take it you did not authorize Philby assassinating Franco?" "Of course not. Yazov told me that Philby should be instructed to get close to Franco and kill him. He said by your order." Stalin threw one of his rather regular fits. "Where is that little cocksucker?" "At this precise moment, he's in Leningrad." "Vlad, cancel any orders he may have given to that effect and get that little fucking dwarf here fast, even if you have to arrest him. I cannot believe that that bullshit talk we had about Philby and Franco could be interpreted that way. If he's that stupid, he has to go. If he's not stupid, then he's a traitor, highly placed. What the fuck is going to happen to this country when I die? I can't believe it. How long would Philby last under torture? 30 minutes? He'd probably have a heart attack and die before they started." "Exactly. And how long before it comes to my doorstep? Franco assassinated by an irate Spanish worker is one thing. By me, quite another. How long before they find out about Philby's communism? Fuck my eyes. What was the dwarf thinking?" The boss, on second thought, relieved Molotov of this responsibility and reached for one of his telephones, punching the familiar intercom button. "Beria, the time may have come. Arrest Yazov. Armed guards surround him. You know what to do, but bring him to my Kremlin office first. I want him ASAP. I have to talk to him myself then, if necessary. I'm already prepared. Lavrenti, just be sure he's unarmed when he comes to the Kremlin, otherwise the boys will kill him. I want to talk to him first." "Done." The boss hung up and turned to Molotov. "You've done extremely well, Vlad. You always do extremely well. By far, you're the most competent person I've ever known. Now, as you know, it's time for me to take over directly, meaning Philby's reports come straight to me through you. Until the Chica foreign operations are reorganized, I want it out of the circuit. You can read Philby's messages, of course, but I would prefer, when possible, you do it here in front of me, just to be sure there's no delay in any communication, which by definition is urgent, or I wouldn't be getting it instantly. And of course, keep talking to him on the radio for us. Vlad, it's imperative that we move our top men up the ladder. War is at best just a few years away. I have to have a man next to M, and whomever the British PM happens to be when the time comes. I want you to get him through Spain in one piece, and be sure he is safe to the degree you can. He's going to have to be there for a while. After all, we don't know for sure how long this fucking mess in Spain is going to go on. However, I want him there for as long a time as possible. You see, it's very likely that the Brit capitalists are going to end up with their long-desired London-Berlin-Rome axis, in which case the role of Philby as anti-Soviet, anti-communist chief within MI6 will be critical. Now, this is the only way we have now, anyway, to build his prestige in British ruling circles. You know I do not care what it costs, as long as you keep him safe as possible, actively sending back journalistic pro-fascist dispatches to that idiot capitalist newspaper. When the time comes for Philby to go back to London, we will engineer his recruitment into MI6. History will take care of the rest. Now, Beria is our best man for the Iberian Peninsula. Let me suggest that you handle Philby via him. No, Vlad, I'll handle Philby the way I say. Now, what about Sorga? And that brings us to a conclusion of this first lecture on proxy war in Europe. And we're going to continue with it tomorrow in the next